In the tech corridors of San Francisco, a successful entrepreneur was about to uncover the ultimate betrayal. What started as a romantic anniversary dinner took a shocking turn when he came face to face with encrypted messages revealing his wife's deadly plan. James Whitmore wasn't your typical victim. For 5 years, he had spent his life building a multi-million-dollar empire from nothing. Known for his methodical precision and unwavering trust in those he loved, until the night he discovered his entire marriage was an elaborate con designed to end with his murder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special. For you, the champagne bubbles caught the soft light from the candles Victoria had arranged around their Pacific Heights dining room, creating tiny prisms that danced across the mahogany table. James Whitmore lifted his glass, watching his wife's face glow in the warm amber light as she smiled at him across their 5th wedding anniversary dinner. Everything was perfect, too perfect, he would later realize. To us, Victoria said, her voice carrying that melodic quality that had first captivated him at the charity gala 5 years ago. 5 wonderful years and many more to come. James clinked his glass against hers, the crystal singing a clear, pure note that seemed to hang in the air between them. To us, he echoed, though something indefinable made the words feel hollow in his mouth. Perhaps it was the way Victoria's eyes didn't quite meet his when she spoke, or how her smile seemed to flicker for just a moment, like a mask briefly slipping before being adjusted back into place. They had built this life together, brick by careful brick. The sprawling home with its panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay, the successful software company he'd grown from a cramped garage startup into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, the carefully curated social circle of tech luminaries and philanthropists. Victoria had been there through it all, the perfect partner, supporting his vision while maintaining her own mysterious independence that he'd found so alluring. "I need to check something on my laptop," Victoria said after they'd finished the dessert she'd prepared, his favorite chocolate souffle. "Just a quick email from the gallery. You know how neurotic artists can be about their exhibitions?" James nodded. Accustomed to Victoria's work as an art consultant that often required late-night communications with temperamental clients, he watched her ascend the curved staircase to her home office, her silk dress rustling against the banister. The sound was familiar, comforting even, part of the domestic symphony they'd composed together over half a decade. 20 minutes passed, then 30. James found himself growing restless, the wine making him sentimental and slightly impulsive. He wanted to surprise her, perhaps suggest they take a walk along the bay to continue their celebration under the stars. The house felt too quiet, too still for such a momentous evening. He climbed the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the Persian runner Victoria had insisted upon during their remodel 2 years prior. Her office door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway. You could hear the soft clicking of keyboard, keys rapid, urgent typing that seemed oddly intense for a casual email to an artist. "Vic," he called softly, pushing the door open wider. "I was thinking we could," the words died in his throat. Victoria's laptop screen faced away from the door, but he could see her reflection in the dark window behind her desk. Yes. Her face was illuminated by the screen's glow, and the expression he saw there was nothing like the loving wife who had toasted their anniversary moments before. Her features were sharp, calculating, her eyes narrowed in concentration as she typed. It was the face of a stranger. "Oh," Victoria spun around, her hand moving instinctively to close the laptop, but not before James caught a glimpse of what looked like an encrypted messaging application, not the email client she'd claimed to be using. "James, you startled me." The mask was back in place so quickly that James almost convinced himself he'd imagined the transformation. Almost, "Sorry, sweetheart. I was just wondering if you wanted to take that walk we talked about earlier." He kept his voice casual, even as his mind raced to process what he'd witnessed. "Of course. Just give me 2 more minutes to finish this up." Her smile was radiant, warm, everything he'd fallen in love with. "Why don't you get our coats?" James nodded and backed out of the room, but instead of heading to the closet, he lingered in the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the crack in the door, he could hear Victoria's fingers flying across the keyboard again. That same urgent rhythm that spoke of conversations far more complex than artist negotiations. The smart home system he'd designed for their house included security features that logged all network activity. It was a habit from his tech background. He monitored their digital footprint, the way other people checked their credit scores. But he'd never thought to examine Victoria's usage patterns. Why would he? Trust had been the foundation of their marriage, solid and unquestioned. Until now. After their walk, a stilted affair where Victoria seemed distracted despite her attempts at conversation, James waited until she fell asleep beside him. The familiar sound of her breathing, which had once lulled him to sleep, now seemed like the rhythm of a stranger. He slipped from their bed at 2 a.m. and made his way to his own office down the hall. The network logs painted a picture that made his stomach clench with a sick, familiar dread, the same feeling he'd experienced as a 10-year-old boy when he'd found his father's suitcase packed and hidden in the garage, 3 weeks before the man disappeared from their lives, forever. Victoria had been using encrypted messaging apps for months, not occasionally, but daily. Long conversations that happened while he was at work, or during the evenings when she claimed to be reading in her bath. The data timestamps showed sessions, lasting hours, always carefully timed around his schedule. With hands that trembled slightly, James accessed his administrative privileges to their shared cloud storage. What he found there made the world tilt on its axis. Hidden in a folder disguised as photo backups were documents he'd never seen before, financial records showing transfers from their joint accounts to accounts he didn't recognize, legal papers he'd never signed, insurance policies with beneficiaries that had been changed without his knowledge. But it was the encrypted messages he managed to decrypt using his software expertise that shattered his world completely. Marcus, the timeline needs to move up. I'm getting nervous about the audit. Victoria, patience. 5 years of investment deserves a proper return. Life insurance alone is worth $5 million. Marcus. And if he gets suspicious? Victoria, he won't. James trusts me completely. He's too much in love to see what's right in front of him. Poor thing still thinks our marriage is real. Marcus, when do we execute the exit strategy? Victoria, 6 months. By then, the remaining assets will be properly positioned. We disappear, he's left with nothing. And everyone feels sorry for the widower whose wife died in that tragic car accident we've been planning. James stared at the screen until the words blurred together. 5 years. 5 years of his life, of building what he thought was a partnership, a family, a future. 5 years of believing in a love that had been calculated and performed with the precision of a business transaction. The rest of the messages revealed the depth of the deception. Victoria wasn't even her real name. She was Victoria Cross, a woman with a history of targeting wealthy men. Marcus Campbell was her partner in more than just crime. They'd been together for years, running elaborate long-term cons on successful bachelors. James was simply the latest mark in a string of victims who'd been systematically destroyed. As dawn broke over San Francisco Bay, painting their bedroom in soft pastels that should have been beautiful, James sat in his office chair and watched his wife sleep through the open doorway. She looked peaceful, innocent even, her dark hair spread across the pillow he'd bought for her last Christmas. But now he knew the truth. He was sharing his bed with a predator. The rage came in waves, alternating with a grief so profound it made him physically ill. But underneath both emotions, something else began to crystallize a cold. Methodical anger that felt foreign and familiar at the same time. It was the same calculating fury that had driven him to work 18-hour days building his company. The relentless focus that had made him successful. James could confront Victoria, of course. He could call the police, hire lawyers, try to salvage what was left of his assets and his dignity. But she and Marcus had been planning this for years, and they undoubtedly had contingencies for discovery. By the time the legal system ground through the complexities of financial fraud, they would be long gone with his money. No, James realized as he watched Victoria stir in their bed, stretching like a contented cat in the morning light. If she wanted to play games, he would play games. But he would play by his own rules. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, his childhood friend, who had become a psychologist. someone he'd deliberately avoided during his marriage because Victoria had always found excuses for them not to socialize. Now he understood why. "Sarah," he said when she answered, his voice carefully modulated to sound stressed but not desperate.
Oh.
"It's James Whitmore. I know it's early, but I was wondering if you might have some time to see me professionally. I've been having some anxiety issues, and I think I could use someone to talk to." As he made the appointment, Victoria appeared in the doorway of his office. Wearing the silk robe he'd given her for their anniversary the year before, her hair was tousled from sleep, her face soft with what looked like genuine affection. "Everything okay, darling?" she asked, moving to stand behind his chair and placing her hands on his shoulders. "You're up early?" It's a touch that had once thrilled him now felt like ice water on his skin. But James smiled up at her, allowing none of his newfound knowledge to show in his expression. "Just couldn't sleep," he said, covering her hand with his own. "Too much excitement from last night, I think." Victoria leaned down and kissed the top of his head, and James forced himself not to recoil from the lips that had spoken such poison about him just hours before. "Well, try to get some rest today," she murmured against his hair. "You work too. Hard." As she padded back to their bedroom, James stared at his reflection in the black computer screen. The man looking back at him was someone he'd barely recognized, someone capable of deception, of planning, of revenge. Someone who could smile and lie as easily as the woman he'd married. The transformation had already begun. 3 weeks had passed since James discovered the truth about his marriage, and each day had been a masterclass in performance art. He perfected the role of the loving, unsuspecting husband, while methodically building his case against Victoria like he was developing a software architecture layer by layer, function by function, with redundancies built in to prevent system failure. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office in the Mission District felt like a sanctuary, the only place where James could drop his carefully constructed mask. The space was warm and unpretentious, filled with soft lighting and the kind of comfortable furniture that encouraged honesty. Sarah herself hadn't changed much since their college days, still sharpened behind wire-rimmed glasses, still possessed of that uncanny ability to see through people's facades that had made her popular at parties and intimidating to anyone with secrets. "You seem different, James," Sarah said during their third session, her pen poised over her notepad. "It's more focused, but also more distant, even from yourself." James shifted in the leather chair that had become familiar over the past weeks. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about patterns, about how people can live double lives and maintain them for years without detection. That's oddly specific." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are we talking about someone in particular?" The question hung in the air between them. James had been carefully circling around the truth, using their sessions to process his discovery without revealing the full scope of Victoria's betrayal or his own plans for retaliation. But Sarah's intuition was as sharp as he remembered. "Hypothetically," James said carefully, "if someone discovered that their entire life was built on a lie, what would be the psychologically healthiest way to respond?" Hypothetically. Sarah's tone suggested she wasn't buying the distance he was trying to create. "I'd say that confronting the truth directly, with support from trusted friends and professionals, would be the healthiest approach, allowing the deception to continue while planning some kind of elaborate response." She paused, studying his face. "That path leads to psychological fragmentation. You risk becoming the very thing you're fighting against." James nodded, filing away her words, even as he dismissed their application to his situation. Sarah didn't understand the complexity of what he was dealing with. This wasn't a simple case of infidelity that could be resolved with couples therapy and honest communication. This was a criminal conspiracy that had been years in the making. After leaving Sarah's office, James drove to a coffee shop in the Sunset District where he'd arranged to meet the private investigator he'd hired. Marcus's Webb. The irony of the name wasn't lost on him. Was a former police detective who'd gone into private practice after a commendation-worthy career in white-collar crime. Webb was everything James had hoped for: thorough, discreet, and completely without moral judgment about his client's motivations. "Your wife is a professional, Mr. Whitmore," Webb said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the small table. "Victoria Crossand, that is her real name," by the way, has been running these types of operations for almost a decade. We've identified at least 3 previous victims, all successful men who lost substantial assets before she disappeared from their lives. James opened the envelope with hands that remained perfectly steady, though his heart was racing. Were photographs, financial records, and what looked like a complete dossier on Victoria's previous life. The woman in the older photos was recognizably his wife, but younger, wearing different clothes, different jewelry, different personas for different marks. Richard Ashford, tech executive in Seattle, Webb continued, pointing to a photograph of Victoria with a man James didn't recognize. Lost $1.8 million before she vanished. David Chen, real estate developer in Los Angeles, $2.3 million. And Dr. Michael Torres, a surgeon in Phoenix, $1 million. The amounts are escalating, and the timeline between victims is getting longer. She's becoming more sophisticated. What about Marcus Campbell? James asked, studying a surveillance photo of Victoria and Marcus together outside what appeared to be an expensive restaurant. Former investment banker, lost his license after an insider trading scandal 5 years ago. Clean record since then. Officially, but our sources suggest he's been working as Victoria's partner for at least the last 4 years. They're not just lovers, they're business partners in a very specific type of fraud. James absorbed this information with the same methodical focus he brought to debugging complex code. Each piece of data was another element in the larger program. He was writing a program designed to expose and destroy the people who had systematically stolen his life. There's more, Webb said, lowering his voice. We found evidence that they've been planning this particular operation for over 2 years. They researched you extensively before Victoria engineered that meeting at the charity gala. Your financial profile, your psychological profile, even your father's abandonment. They knew about all of it. The mention of his father hit James like a physical blow. He thought of that 10-year-old boy finding the packed suitcase. The months of wondering what he'd done wrong, the years of building walls to protect himself from abandonment. Victoria had weaponized his deepest trauma. I need more than evidence, James said quietly. I need to understand their complete operational structure. Timeline, escape routes, contingencies, everything. Webb studied him for a long moment. Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask, what exactly are you planning to do with this information? If you're thinking about confronting them directly or taking matters into your own hands, I'm thinking about justice, James replied, the kind that actually works. That evening, James sat in his home office while Victoria prepared dinner downstairs, another performance in their elaborate domestic theater. He could hear her humming while she cooked, the same melody she'd hummed on their wedding day. Sound that had once filled him with warmth now made his skin crawl. His computer screens displayed the fruits of his investigation, financial records showing the systematic drainage of his accounts, communication logs revealing the timing of Victoria and Marcus's conversations, travel records that painted a picture of their planned escape route. But scattered among the data were other windows research into digital identity creation, offshore banking systems, and surveillance equipment. James was building more than a case against Victoria. He was building a new identity for himself. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Brennan, his business partner and closest friend. Everything okay? You seem distracted lately. Sarah mentioned you've been seeing her professionally. James stared at the message for a long moment. Thomas had been asking questions about his behavior for the past week, noting his distraction during meetings, his unusual attention to financial details, his questions about business continuity plans. Sarah must have expressed concern about his mental state, though doctor-patient confidentiality would prevent her from sharing specifics. Both Thomas and Sarah represented his old life, the person he used to be when he believed in trust and honesty, and straightforward solutions to complex problems. But that person had been naive, vulnerable to exactly the kind of predator who was downstairs humming while she planned his destruction. Just working through some personal issues, James texted. Back. Nothing I can't handle. He was working through personal issues. He was systematically preparing to destroy the people who had destroyed him. And in the process, he was discovering exactly how far he was willing to go for what he now recognized as justice, rather than revenge. Victoria called from downstairs that dinner was ready, her voice warm and loving and completely artificial. James saved his work, encrypted the files, and prepared to go downstairs and perform his role as the devoted husband for another evening. But as he descended the stairs, James realized that the performance was becoming easier each day. The lies came more naturally now, the deception felt more comfortable, and the person he was becoming felt more real than the person he used to be. The transformation was accelerating, and James wasn't entirely certain he wanted to stop it. The decision crystallized during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning meeting with Thomas Brennan. They sat in the conference room of their company's Soma headquarters, surrounded by whiteboards covered in product roadmaps and financial projections, discussing quarterly targets as if James's world hadn't fundamentally shifted on its axis. The Q4 numbers look solid, Thomas was saying, his finger tracing a upward trend line on his tablet. If we can maintain current growth rates, we'll hit our revenue targets 6 weeks early. He paused, studying James's face. You're not listening, are you? James forced himself to focus on his business partner's concerned expression. Thomas had been his anchor since college, the practical one, who balanced James's visionary tendencies. The steady friend who'd helped him navigate every major decision of his adult life. Every decision except this one. Sorry. Just thinking about contingencies, James said, which wasn't entirely a lie. What would happen to the company if something happened to me? Do we have adequate succession planning? Thomas set down his tablet and leaned back in his chair. James, what the hell is going on with you? Sarah won't tell me anything specific because of doctor-patient privilege, but she's worried. You've been acting strange for weeks, asking weird hypothetical questions, obsessing over financial details that never concerned you before. The moment had arrived sooner than James had anticipated. He'd planned to ease Thomas into the conversation, gradually, but his friend's directness demanded a more immediate response. James made a calculation, the same type of risk-benefit analysis he used for major business decisions, and decided to trust the one person who might understand. If I told you that everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie, James said carefully, and that the only way to expose the truth required doing something that might destroy my old life completely, would you help me? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression shifting from concern to alarm. This is about Victoria, isn't it? James opened his laptop and turned it toward Thomas. On the screen were carefully selected portions of his investigation, the financial records showing systematic theft, Victoria's real identity, photographs of her with previous victims. He watched his friend's face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally, anger. Jesus Christ, James, how long have you known? 3 weeks? And you haven't confronted her? Haven't called the police? James closed the laptop. She's too smart for that. By the time the legal system could respond, she and Marcus would be gone with everything. They've been planning this for years, Thomas. They have escape routes, contingencies, probably new identities already prepared. Thomas stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of San Francisco Bay. So what are you planning to do? Something that will expose them completely. Something they won't see coming because it requires sacrificing. Everything I've built is James Whitmore. You're talking about faking your death. Thomas's voice was flat, matter of fact, as if he was discussing a software feature rather than an elaborate deception. James wasn't surprised that Thomas had reached the conclusion so quickly. They'd worked together for 15 years. Thomas knew how his mind operated, how he approached complex problems by breaking them down into component parts and rebuilding them according to new parameters. It's the only way to observe their true behavior without interference. Once they think I'm dead, Victoria will drop her mask completely. I'll have video evidence of everything: her celebrations, her money transfers, her real personality. Evidence that will hold up in court and expose their entire operation. Thomas turned from the window, and then what? You can't come back from the dead without admitting to fraud yourself. You'd be destroying your life to destroy theirs. My life is already destroyed, James said quietly. The question is whether I let them get away with it or whether I make... Sure, they can't do this to anyone else. Over the next hour, James outlined his plan, with the same methodical precision he brought to product development. The boating accident would occur during a solo sailing trip, something he did regularly, so it wouldn't seem suspicious. He'd already researched the currents in San Francisco Bay, identified locations where a body might never be recovered. Boat would be found damaged but empty. With evidence of his deteriorating mental state planted in advance to support a suicide narrative, Thomas listened, without interruption, occasionally asking technical questions that James answered with disturbing thoroughness. The new identity was already in development: David Carter, a freelance technology consultant with a clean background and legitimate documentation. The safe house was rented under a shell corporation. The surveillance equipment was ordered and ready for installation. "You've thought of everything," Thomas said when James finished, "except the psychological cost. You're planning to watch your wife celebrate your death? You're planning to become someone else entirely. You have any idea what that will do to you?" James had been asking himself the same question for days. During his sessions with Sarah, he'd begun to understand that his elaborate plan wasn't just about justice, it was about control. Victoria had made him feel powerless, had turned him into a victim without his knowledge or consent. This plan would reverse that dynamic completely. "I know it will change me," James admitted. "I'm already changing. Every day I pretend to love her. Every night I lie next to her knowing what she's planning. I'm becoming someone I don't recognize anyway. At least this way, the transformation serves a purpose." Thomas was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the bay where James planned to stage his death. Finally, he turned back to his oldest friend. "If you're determined to do this insane thing, you'll need help. Someone on the outside who knows you're alive. Someone who can monitor the situation and extract you if things go wrong." James felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. "Thomas, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm volunteering. But I have conditions." Thomas's voice carried the same authority he used during difficult negotiations. "First, you check in with me every day. Miss a check-in, and I call the police myself. Second, we set a time limit, 3 months maximum. After that, you surface, and we deal with the legal consequences together. Third, you continue seeing Sarah throughout this whole thing, even if you have to lie about who you are." They spent the rest of the morning working out the operational details. Thomas would handle the business continuity issues, ensuring that James's death wouldn't destroy the company they'd built together. He would also serve as liaison with the authorities, providing them with James's mental health history to support the suicide narrative. That evening, James sat across from Victoria at dinner, watching her perform her loving wife routine while he finalized his own performance as the doomed husband. She had prepared his favorite meal, grilled salmon with the dill sauce she knew. He loved and was telling him about her day with animated enthusiasm. "The Hendersons are finally ready to commission that landscape piece we discussed," she said, her eyes bright with apparent excitement. "It's a substantial project enough to keep me busy for months." James nodded and smiled, recognizing the irony. Victoria was planning her exit strategy while he was planning his. They were both preparing elaborate deceptions, both committed to destroying the other's life. The difference was that only one of them knew they were in competition. After dinner, James excused himself for a final therapy session with Sarah. He sat in her familiar office, surrounded by the warm lighting and comfortable furniture that had become his confessional, and prepared to lie to the one person who'd been trying to help him maintain his sanity. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," he told her, "about confronting problems directly instead of allowing them to fester. You're right, I need to deal with my anxiety head-on instead of letting it control my behavior." Sarah smiled, apparently pleased by his apparent breakthrough. "That's encouraging, James. What specific steps are you planning to take?" "I'm going to take some time off work, maybe a solo sailing trip to clear my head and gain some perspective. Sometimes the best way to solve a complex problem is to step away from it completely." "That sounds like a healthy approach. Will Victoria be joining you?" James met her eyes steadily. "No, this is something I need to do alone. Some journeys you have to take by yourself." As he left Sarah's office for what he knew would be the last time as James Whitmore, he reflected on the truth of his final words to her. He was about to embark on a journey that would fundamentally alter not just his identity, but his understanding of who he was capable of becoming. The point of no return was no longer ahead of him. It was beneath his feet, and he was already falling. David Carter stood at the window of his studio apartment in the Richmond district, watching his former home through high-powered binoculars as his wife performed the role of grieving widow for the gathering crowd of concerned.
Our neighbors.
3 days had passed since James Whitmore's boat had been found, drifting empty in San Francisco Bay. Victoria's performance was nothing short of masterful. The transformation from James to David had been surprisingly seamless. A new identity. It felt like putting on a well-tailored suit, comfortable at first, but quickly becoming second nature. David Carter was 42, a freelance technology consultant with a modest background and unremarkable history. He had cash reserves, a clean apartment lease, and most importantly, no connection to the late James Whitmore. Through his surveillance equipment, cameras positioned to monitor the Pacific Heights house from multiple angles, audio devices that could pick up conversations through windows, and network taps that intercepted all digital communications, watched Victoria navigate her first week of widowhood with calculated precision. The public Victoria was everything one would expect from a devastated spouse. She accepted condolences with graceful tears, spoke to reporters with appropriate reluctance about her husband's recent struggles with anxiety and depression, and maintained the perfect balance between grief and dignity that made everyone around her want to comfort and protect her. But the private Victoria, the woman David observed when she thought she was alone, was an entirely different creature. On Thursday morning, he watched her pace around their former living room while speaking animatedly on her encrypted phone. Even without audio, her body language radiated excitement rather than grief. She gestured expansively, occasionally pumping her fist in what could only be interpreted as celebration. When she finally ended the call, she actually danced a brief, uninhibited moment of pure joy that she immediately suppressed when the doorbell rang. The visitor was Detective Rachel Stevens, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to seeing through lies. David had researched her thoroughly after learning she'd been assigned to investigate his death. 20-year veteran of the SFPD, specialized in financial crimes. Divorced with a reputation for persistence that had made her both respected and occasionally resented by colleagues who preferred easier cases. David adjusted his audio equipment and listened as Stevens questioned Victoria about his mental state, their financial situation, and the circumstances leading up to his solo sailing trip. Victoria's responses were perfect concerned, but not overly dramatic, helpful but appropriately overwhelmed by grief. He'd been so stressed lately, Victoria told the detective, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The business pressures, some anxiety issues he was working through with his therapist. I suggested he take some time off, maybe see someone professionally, but James was always so private about his feelings. Stevens took notes, but David noticed how her eyes moved around the room, cataloging details, studying Victoria's demeanor. This was not a detective who would accept convenient explanations without thorough investigation. I'll need to examine his computer and phone records, Stevens said. Standard procedure in cases like this? Of course, Victoria replied without hesitation. Anything that might help explain what happened. I keep hoping he's out there somewhere, that maybe he's hurt and can't get help. Had to admire the performance, even as it sickened him. Victoria had spent weeks preparing for this exact conversation, crafting responses that would satisfy police scrutiny while maintaining her image as the devoted wife. She'd even managed to produce tears on cue. After Stevens left, David watched Victoria's mask slip away entirely, immediately called Marcus, her excitement palpable even through the surveillance feed. The detective seemed satisfied with the suicide narrative, she said, her voice carrying none of the grief she'd displayed moments before. James did such a thorough job setting up his mental health history that they're buying it completely. The irony wasn't lost on David his own. Careful preparation was now being used to support Victoria's version of events. He'd wanted his death to be believable enough to avoid intensive investigation, but not so believable that it would prevent him from eventually proving Victoria's crimes. When can we start moving the money? He heard Marcus ask through the audio feed. Soon, we need to wait at least a week to avoid suspicion. But the life insurance company has already confirmed they'll process the claim once the death certificate is issued. 2.5 million, plus whatever we can liquidate from his accounts before anyone thinks to freeze them. David felt his hands clench into fists as he listened to them discuss the dismantling of his life with the casual efficiency of accountants. Reviewing quarterly reports, these people had planned every detail of his destruction. And now they were executing that plan with James Whitmore conveniently out of the way. But the most disturbing revelation came that evening when David observed Victoria hosting Eleanor Hartley, their elderly neighbor, for what appeared to be a condolence visit. Eleanor was a retired teacher in her 70s, sharp-minded and observant, who had lived next door to the Whitmores for over a decade. "I still can't believe James would do something like this," Eleanor was saying as she accepted a cup of tea. "From Victoria, he seemed so stable, so happy with you." "People hide their pain," Victoria replied with practiced sadness. "I blame myself for not seeing the signs." But Eleanor wasn't finished. "It's just strange, you know. I've been watching this neighborhood for years, and I noticed some odd things lately. Men coming and going at unusual hours, expensive cars that didn't belong to any of the residents." David saw Victoria's posture stiffen slightly, though her expression remained unchanged. "Oh, last Tuesday, I saw a man leaving your house around midnight. Tall, well-dressed, driving a black BMW. I thought it might be James coming home late from work. But the build was all wrong." David zoomed in on Victoria's face through his surveillance camera. For just a moment, he saw something flicker in. Her eyes' calculation, perhaps concern. Eleanor had witnessed Marcus visiting the house during one of their planning sessions. "I'm sure it was just someone turning around in our driveway," Victoria said smoothly. "You know how confusing these hills can be at night?" Eleanor nodded, but David could see she wasn't entirely convinced. The old woman was more observant than Victoria had anticipated, and her attention to detail could potentially complicate the widow's carefully constructed narrative. After Eleanor left, David watched Victoria immediately call Marcus to warn him about the neighbor's observations. They decided to accelerate their timeline rather than waiting weeks to begin liquidating assets. They would start moving money within days. "We need to be more careful," Victoria said. "The old woman sees everything. If Detective Stevens talks to her, should we be worried?" Marcus asked. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and David saw her face take on an expression he'd never witnessed before: cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. "Eleanor Hartley has always been too nosy for her own good," Victoria said finally.
"Oh.
"Maybe it's time someone reminded her that elderly people have accidents all the time." David felt ice water flood his veins. Victoria wasn't just a financial predator, she was contemplating something far more dangerous. The woman he'd been married to for 5 years, the woman he'd shared his bed and his dreams with, was casually discussing the possibility of harming an innocent elderly woman whose only crime was paying attention to her surroundings. As he watched Victoria move through their former home, efficiently going through James Whitmore's belongings and sorting them into piles, some for keeping, some for discarding, some for selling, David realized that his elaborate plan to expose her crimes might have unleashed something far worse than financial fraud. He was no longer just watching a con artist celebrate her victory. He was watching a predator eliminate obstacles to her survival. And Eleanor Hartley had just identified herself as a potential threat. The game had changed, and David was no longer sure he controlled the rules. David Carter sat in a diner in Oakland, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee while waiting for Amanda Cross to arrive. Finding Victoria's estranged sister had required weeks of investigation through Marcus Webb's contacts. Following a trail of changed names and carefully hidden addresses that painted a picture of someone desperately trying to stay invisible, the woman who finally walked through the diner's door looked nothing like Victoria. Where his wife was polished and commanding, Amanda appeared worn down by life, thin to the point of fragility. With prematurely gray hair and the kind of nervous energy that came from years of looking over her shoulder, she scanned the restaurant twice before approaching his table, and even then she kept her purse clutched tightly in her lap. "You said on the phone that Victoria is dead," Amanda said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I know you're not working?" For her, David had anticipated her suspicion. From his research, He knew that Amanda Cross had been financially and emotionally destroyed by her sister 5 years earlier, left bankrupt and psychologically shattered by what the police had dismissed as a family financial dispute. Been living under the name Amanda Phillips ever since, working as a night clerk at a budget motel and avoiding any situation that might bring her to Victoria's attention. "Because Victoria doesn't know I exist," David replied, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed Victoria and Marcus celebrating in the Pacific Heights house, taken through his surveillance equipment just 2 days earlier. And because I'm the only person who can prove what she really is? Amanda studied the photograph with an expression that cycled through recognition, fear, and finally, something that might have been hope. "That's her, with the investment banker. They're still together? You know Marcus Campbell?" "I know what he is, but they both are." Amanda's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a terrible secret for years. "Victoria isn't my sister?" "Not really. We grew up together in foster care, but we're not related by blood. She just took over my identity when it was convenient." Over the next hour, Amanda told David a story that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about his wife. Victoria Cross had been born Jennifer Walsh, child of the system who'd learned early that survival meant manipulation and deception. Amanda had been her younger sister in a group home, vulnerable and trusting, with a social security number and birth certificate that Victoria eventually appropriated. "She didn't just steal my money," Amanda explained, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "She stole my entire life, my credit, my identity, my relationships. When she was done with me, I had to completely disappear and start over, because she'd made it impossible for the real Amanda Cross to exist." David thought of Detective Stevens, of her growing suspicion about his staged death, and realized that Victoria's criminal history was far more extensive than even Webb's investigation had revealed. "How many others have there been? I only know about the ones after me." She always used the same pattern: research wealthy, isolated men, create an elaborate courtship that lasted long enough to gain access to their finances, then disappear. After staging some kind of tragedy that would prevent them from pursuing her, Amanda opened her worn purse and pulled out a small notebook filled with careful handwriting. "I've been tracking her for years, not to get revenge, just to know when she moved on to someone new, so I could warn them if I ever got brave." Enough. The notebook contained a timeline that made David's blood run cold. Victoria's operations were becoming more sophisticated and more destructive with each iteration. The early victims had lost money, but survived. More recent ones had suffered complete financial and psychological destruction, and according to Amanda's notes, Victoria was escalating. "The surgeon in Phoenix," Amanda said, pointing to an entry from 2 years earlier. "Dr. Michael Torres. He didn't just lose his money. 3 months after Victoria disappeared, he killed himself." David stared at the notation in Amanda's careful handwriting. Victoria hadn't just destroyed Torres financially, she'd destroyed him completely, leaving him so broken that death seemed like the only escape. The woman David had married wasn't just a con artist. She was someone who destroyed lives with the casual efficiency of a natural disaster. "There's something else," Amanda continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Victoria's been planning something different this time. Bigger. I heard her talking to Marcus about a final score that would let them retire permanently." "What kind of final score?" Amanda's hands were shaking more noticeably now. "Murder. David, she's planning to kill her current husband and make it look like suicide. She's done it before, but this time she wants to make sure there are no loose ends. No witnesses who might complicate her story." The words hit David like a physical blow. His elaborate plan to fake his death and expose Victoria's crimes had inadvertently provided her with the perfect cover for actual murder. She was using his staged suicide as a template for future victims, refining her technique based on what she learned from his death. "When did you hear this?" "Last month. Still have contacts from our foster care days, people who keep track of Victoria's movements. She's been very careful, but she's also been excited about this operation. She told someone it would be her masterpiece." David thought of Eleanor Hartley, of Victoria's casual suggestion that the elderly woman might have an accident. He thought of Detective Stevens's growing suspicion, Thomas's unwitting complicity in his deception. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, still believing she was treating a patient who no longer existed. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Police. Came by the office asking more questions about your mental state. Detective seems suspicious about something. Be careful. David showed the message to Amanda, who read it with growing alarm. She knows you're alive? I don't think so. But she's too good at her job to accept convenient explanations. If she keeps digging, Victoria will know her operation is compromised, Amanda finished. And when Victoria feels threatened, people get hurt, really hurt. They sat in silence for several minutes, both contemplating the implications of what Amanda had revealed. David's plan to expose Victoria through careful observation was collapsing under the weight of her actual criminal history. This wasn't a sophisticated financial fraud. It was a pattern of escalating violence that had already claimed at least one life. I have to stop her, David said finally. Amanda grabbed his wrist across the table. You don't understand what she's capable of. Victoria doesn't just hurt people, she destroys them completely. She takes everything. Money, identity, hope, sometimes life itself. If she finds out you're alive, she won't just kill you. She'll make sure you suffer first. Then, I need to expose her before she has the chance. The police don't believe her victims because she's too smart to leave obvious evidence. The financial crimes are too complex for most investigators to understand. And now she has experienced staging deaths that look like suicide. David thought of his surveillance equipment, of the hours of footage showing Victoria's private celebrations and planning sessions. I have video evidence of her real behavior. Her admissions about previous victims, her discussions with Marcus about their plans. Amanda shook her head. It won't be enough. Victoria's too careful, too experienced. She'll have explanations for everything, ways to discredit the evidence or claim it was taken out of context. Then what do you suggest? Amanda was quiet for a long moment, staring out the diner's window at the Oakland traffic. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a resolution that hadn't been there before. We give her what she wants, she said. We let her think she's won completely. And then we trap her in a situation where she has to reveal her true nature in a way that can't be explained away. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. What are you suggesting? Amanda met his eyes directly, for the first time since she'd sat down. We make Victoria think she needs to kill again. We make sure Detective Stevens is watching when she tries. David's hands trembled as he adjusted the surveillance monitor, watching Detective Rachel Stevens examine his former home office with methodical precision. She'd returned with a warrant that morning, and her investigation was far more thorough than he'd anticipated. She photographed everything, collected computer equipment, spent considerable time studying the financial documents he'd deliberately left behind to support his suicide narrative. What he hadn't expected was her expertise in digital forensics. Through his audio feed, he listened as she spoke to her partner about inconsistencies in his online activity, patterns and discrepancies in the timing of his supposed mental breakdown. The search history doesn't match the profile, Stevens was saying, as she bagged James's laptop. Someone who's planning suicide typically shows escalating research into methods, locations, or final arrangements. Whitmore's browsing history shows research into surveillance equipment, identity creation, and offshore banking. That's not depression, that's planning. David felt sweat bead on his forehead. His careful preparation was being turned against him by an investigator who understood the psychology of actual suicide versus staged death. It caught every precaution he'd taken to make his death believable was now evidence of deception. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Amanda. Victoria knows someone's been asking questions about her past. Her private investigator's getting close to your new identity. You need to move. Now. Three-way hunt was intensifying. Detective Stevens was closing in on proof that James Whitmore had faked his death. Victoria's private investigator was tracking David Carter's activities. And Victoria herself was becoming increasingly paranoid, which made her exponentially more dangerous. David switched to the camera monitoring Eleanor Hartley's house next door. The elderly woman was working in her garden, completely unaware that she'd become a target. Victoria's casual discussion of Eleanor having an accident wasn't theoretical. Any more Amanda's information suggested that Victoria eliminated obstacles with the same methodical planning she brought to financial fraud. Through his surveillance system, David watched Victoria pace her living room while speaking rapidly into her phone. Even without audio, her body language radiated agitation and anger. When she ended the call, she threw the phone across the room with enough force to shatter it against the wall. Moments later, Marcus arrived, and their argument was loud enough for David's audio equipment to capture clearly. The private investigator found the apartment rental Marcus was saying, his voice tight with stress. Someone calling himself David Carter, paying cash, no real background. It's too much of a coincidence? It has to be connected to the questions about my past, Victoria replied, her voice carrying a cold fury David had never heard before. Someone knows too much. Maybe we should just leave. Take what we can liquidate quickly and disappear. Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. We're not running from some amateur investigation. We've invested 2 years in this operation, and I'm not walking away from $2.5 million in life insurance plus James's liquid assets. David watched her move to the window that faced Eleanor's house. Besides, I think I know who's been asking questions. That nosy old bitch next door has been watching this house for months. She probably saw you coming and going, maybe even recognized you from somewhere. You think Eleanor Hartley's investigating? Us. I think Eleanor Hartley talks too much for her own good. And I think it's time someone reminded her that accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business. David's blood ran cold as he watched Victoria outline her plan. Eleanor would have a fall down her own stairs, tragically common among elderly people living alone. It would happen while Victoria was publicly visible elsewhere, establishing an alibi that would deflect any suspicion. But as David listened to the details, he realized Victoria's plan was more sophisticated than simple murder.
Eleanor's death
Would serve multiple purposes, eliminating a potential witness, creating sympathy for Victoria as someone who'd lost her husband and now her dear neighbor, and providing cover for accelerating the timeline to liquidate James's assets. When Marcus asked, tonight. The old woman follows the same routine every evening, locks up at 9:30, goes upstairs to watch the news. I'll disable her porch light to make the stairs more dangerous, then create a distraction that brings her outside. David felt paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Its elaborate plan to expose Victoria had created a situation where an innocent woman was about to be murdered, and he was the only person who could prevent it. His phone rang Thomas, calling with his daily check-in. The police were back at the office, Thomas said without preamble. Detective Stevens asked specifically about your computer skills, whether you'd ever expressed interest in surveillance or identity theft. James, they know you're alive. How? Certain are you? Certain enough that Stevens asked me directly if I was in contact with you? I didn't answer, but she's not stupid. She knows I'd help you if you asked. David closed his eyes, feeling the walls closing in from multiple directions. There's something else. Victoria's planning to kill Eleanor Hartley tonight. She thinks Eleanor's been investigating her. Thomas was quiet for several seconds. You have to call the police. And tell them what? That the dead man they're looking for is watching his wife plan a murder through illegal surveillance equipment. They'll arrest me for fraud before they take the murder threat seriously. Then what are you going to do? David looked at his surveillance monitors, watching Victoria and Marcus finalize their preparations for Eleanor's murder. He thought of Amanda's suggestion about trapping Victoria in a situation where she'd reveal her true nature to Detective Stevens. The plan was dangerous, but circumstances were forcing his hand. I'm going to make sure Detective Stevens witnesses Victoria's true character firsthand, David said. And I'm going to save Eleanor Hartley's life in the process. David was already gathering his equipment, preparing to abandon the safety of his surveillance post for direct intervention. By becoming the kind of person Victoria thinks she killed. As he prepared to leave his apartment, David caught sight of himself in the mirror. The man looking back wasn't James Whitmore, the trusting entrepreneur who'd built a life based on faith in other people's honesty. It wasn't even David Carter, the careful observer, documenting crimes from a safe distance. The person in the mirror was someone new, someone willing to risk everything to prevent an innocent woman's murder. Someone who understood that justice sometimes required becoming as ruthless as the criminals you were fighting. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but David was no longer certain who was predator and who was prey. The porch light at Eleanor Hartley's house flickered once, and died at exactly 9:15 p.m., 15 minutes before her usual routine of locking up for the night. David crouched in the shadows between two parked cars across the street, watching Victoria's plan unfold with sickening precision. She had disabled the light by cutting the wire at the junction box, a simple sabotage that would appear to be an electrical failure after Eleanor's body was discovered at the bottom of her stairs. Through his earpiece, David could hear Detective Stevens coordinating with her backup units. His anonymous tip about suspicious activity, the Hartley residence, had been carefully crafted to sound like a concerned neighbor's observation rather than the detailed intelligence it actually was. Stevens had responded personally, bringing to patrol units and positioning them strategically around the block. Suspect vehicle approaching from the west. Stevens's voice crackled through the police scanner David had acquired. Black BMW license plate matches the description from the neighbor witness. Marcus was arriving right on schedule, bringing the distraction that would lure Eleanor outside into the darkened entryway where she would meet her staged accident. David watched the car park 3 houses down, and Marcus emerged carrying what appeared to be a package but was actually a device designed to trigger Eleanor's motion sensor floodlights from a distance. David's phone vibrated with a text message. "If you're watching this, remember that stopping her now won't undo what she's already done. Some people can't be saved, only stopped." Amanda's message reminded him of Dr. Torres, the surgeon, who had killed himself after Victoria's financial and psychological destruction. How many others had there been? How many victims had suffered in silence because Victoria was too skilled at covering her tracks? At 9:28 p.m., David watched Eleanor begin her nightly routine, moving through her house, turning off lights and checking door locks. She was a creature of habit, predictable in her schedule, which was exactly what Victoria had been counting on. The elderly woman had no idea that her observant nature and unfortunate timing had marked her for death. Victoria emerged from the back of her house at 9:30 exactly, dressed in dark clothing and moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had planned every step. She crossed the narrow space between the properties, staying in the shadows cast by the large oak tree that separated the 2 yards. "Movement detected at the target residence," Stevens reported. "Subject approaching from the south side." David held his breath as Victoria positioned herself near Eleanor's back door. Through his surveillance equipment, he could see Eleanor moving toward the front of her house, preparing to step outside to investigate the motion sensor lights that Marcus would trigger momentarily. The trap was set perfectly. Eleanor would step onto her darkened porch. Marcus would activate the lights to startle her. And in her confusion and temporary blindness, she would miss the step Victoria had carefully loosened earlier that day. Fall would be swift and fatal, and Victoria would be blocks away with an ironclad alibi. But David had spent weeks studying Victoria's methods, and he understood her psychology better than she realized. Her need for control meant she couldn't resist watching her plan unfold. She would position herself where she could observe Eleanor's death, savoring the moment when another obstacle to her plans was eliminated. At 9:31 p.m., Eleanor's front door opened. David keyed his radio to the frequency Stevens was monitoring. "Subject is moving toward the target. Elderly woman is in immediate danger." He watched Stevens signal her team to move closer while maintaining their concealment. The detective's positioning was perfect. She had clear sight lines to both Victoria's hiding spot in Eleanor's front porch. Eleanor stepped onto her darkened porch, confused by the sudden darkness where her porch light should have provided illumination. She moved carefully, one hand on the railing, exactly as Victoria had anticipated. Marcus triggered the floodlights. Eleanor, startled by the sudden illumination, took a step backward, the loosened step that would send her tumbling down the concrete stairs to serious injury or death. But David was already moving. He'd positioned himself during the afternoon, using his knowledge of Eleanor's property to find the optimal intervention point. As Eleanor stumbled backward, David emerged from the shadows and caught her arm, pulling her away from the dangerous step and back toward the safety of her doorway. "Mrs. Hartley, are you all right?" he said loudly enough for Stevens' surveillance equipment to pick up clearly. Eleanor looked up at him in confusion, recognizing him as someone she'd seen around the neighborhood, but couldn't quite place. The lights. Someone was playing with my lights." "You're safe now," David assured her, guiding her back. "Inside her house? I think someone may have been trying to hurt you." Through his earpiece, he heard Stevens coordinate the arrest. "All units move in. Suspect is armed and dangerous." Victoria's reaction to the failure of her plan was everything David had hoped to capture. Instead of retreating when Eleanor was saved, her rage overcame her caution. She stepped out of her hiding place, a tire iron in her hand, the weapon she'd planned to plant near Eleanor's body to suggest the elderly woman had been trying to defend herself against an intruder. "You!" Victoria screamed, recognizing David despite his altered appearance. "You're supposed to be dead." Detective Stevens and her team had perfect positioning to witness Victoria's confession as she attacked the man she believed she'd already killed. David had anticipated her reaction. Victoria's need for control meant she couldn't accept that her carefully orchestrated plan had been disrupted by her supposedly dead husband. "James Whitmore, I presume," Stevens said as her officers surrounded Victoria. "We've been looking for you." Victoria struggled against the officers restraining her, her composure completely shattered. "He's been stalking me, watching me." "Is harassment." "Actually, this is attempted murder," Stevens replied, examining the loosened step David had documented earlier. "We have video evidence of you tampering with Mrs. Hartley's property and clear audio of your confession to murdering your husband." But Victoria's mask wasn't finished falling away. As the reality of her situation penetrated her rage, David watched her calculate one final desperate gambit. "I can give you Marcus Campbell," she said, her voice suddenly calm and rational. "Financial fraud across 6 states, at least 4 victims, connections to money laundering operations. I can give you everything." Stevens looked at David, then back at Victoria. "In exchange for what? Immunity? Witness protection?" Marcus is the real criminal. I was just another victim he manipulated. Even in handcuffs, facing murder charges, Victoria was still performing, still calculating, still trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage by sacrificing her partner and claiming victimhood. David realized that this was Victoria's true face, not the loving wife, not the grief-stricken widow, not even the cold-blooded killer. This was someone so fundamentally disconnected from normal human morality that she could attempt murder and immediately pivot to negotiating deals with law enforcement. "Detective Stevens," David said quietly, "I have video evidence of her planning at least 3 murders, including mine. Whatever deal she's offering, she's planning to break it the moment she thinks she can get away." As Victoria was loaded into the police vehicle, still protesting her innocence and demanding to speak with her lawyer, David felt something he hadn't experienced since discovering her betrayal: emptiness. The woman he'd married, the life he'd built, the person he'd thought he was, none of it had ever been real. Victoria hadn't just stolen his money or broken his heart. She had stolen 5 years of his life and replaced them with an elaborate fiction designed to facilitate his eventual destruction. The mask had fallen away completely, revealing not just Victoria's true nature, but the depths of David's own transformation. In pursuit of justice, the SFPD interrogation room smelled of industrial disinfectant and fear, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the metal table where David sat across from Detective Rachel Stevens. Through the one-way mirror, he could see the reflection of a man he barely recognized, thinner than James Whitmore had been, harder around the eyes, with the kind of stillness that came from months of watching and waiting. "Let's start with the basics," Stevens said, her recorder running between them. "Your legal name is James Robert Whitmore, but you've been living as David Carter for the past 6 weeks. You staged your own death, committed fraud, and conducted illegal surveillance. Do you understand the charges you're facing?" David nodded. "I understand them. I also understand that without my actions, Eleanor Hartley would be dead, and Victoria would have disappeared with stolen assets worth over $3 million. Stevens leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same intensity she'd brought to investigating his death. "Walk me through it. From the beginning. What made a successful tech entrepreneur decide to fake his own death?" For the next 2 hours, David recounted the entire story, from discovering Victoria's encrypted messages to Amanda's revelations about previous victims, from his surveillance operation to the moment he'd saved Eleanor's life. Stevens took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. But mostly she listened with the focus of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to distinguish truth from carefully constructed lies. "The private investigator, Marcus Webb, she said when David finished. "We'll need all his files, all the evidence he gathered about Victoria's previous victims. It's already organized and waiting for you. Financial records, surveillance photos, documentation of the pattern going back 8 years. Victoria Cross isn't just a con artist. She's a serial killer who uses financial fraud to cover her tracks." Stevens was quiet for several minutes, reviewing her notes. When she looked up, her expression was more complex than David had expected. Part professional respect, part concern, part something that might have been pity. "You realize what you've become, don't you?" she said finally. "You've turned yourself into exactly the kind of person your wife was. Deceptive, manipulative, willing to destroy your own identity to achieve your goals." The words hit David like a physical blow because they contained enough truth to hurt. "The difference is that I did it to stop her from killing people. She did it for money? Is that really the difference? Or is that just what you're telling yourself to justify becoming someone you wouldn't have recognized 6 months ago?" Before David could respond, the interrogation room door opened and Victoria was escorted in. Still in handcuffs, but now wearing the orange jumpsuit of the county jail. She'd been processed, photographed, and formally charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts of fraud. But as she took the seat beside her court-appointed attorney, David saw that her composure had returned. "Hello, James," she said, her voice carrying the same warm tone she'd used during their anniversary. "Dinner. You look different. Thinner. This whole experience has been hard on you, hasn't it?" Even now, even here, Victoria was performing. Trying to establish control, trying to manipulate the narrative, trying to position herself as the concerned wife, rather than the woman who'd planned his murder. "I know what you are," David said quietly. "I know about Dr. Torres, about Richard Ashford, David Chin, and all the others. I know about the real Amanda Cross and what you did to her." For the first time since entering the room, Victoria's mask slipped slightly. Her eyes narrowed, and David caught a glimpse of the calculating predator beneath the surface. "You don't know anything," she said. "You're a mentally unstable man who faked his own death and has been stalking his grieving wife. Everything else is the product of your obvious psychological breakdown." Her attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Collins, tried to intervene. "Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly advise you not to." "It's Ms. Cross," Victoria corrected sharply, "and I have nothing to hide. My husband has been suffering from paranoid delusions for months. His fake suicide was clearly a cry for help, and now he's constructing elaborate conspiracy theories to justify his criminal behavior." Stevens placed a tablet on the table between them, showing video footage from David's surveillance operation. Victoria and Marcus were clearly visible, discussing their exit strategy and celebrating James's apparent death. This was recorded. "In your living room 3 days after your husband's boat was found empty," Stevens said. "Would you like to explain why you and Mr. Campbell were celebrating rather than grieving?" Victoria watched the footage without expression, but David could see her mind working, calculating angles and responses. When the video ended, she looked directly at Stevens with the same confidence she'd shown throughout their marriage. "Marcus and I were discussing how to handle the media attention around James's death. What you're interpreting as celebration was actually relief that the news coverage was finally dying down and we could begin to grieve privately. And this," Stevens showed another clip. This one audio enhanced to capture Victoria's voice clearly. "5 years of investment deserves a proper return. The life insurance alone is worth $5 million. Taken out of context, Victoria replied smoothly. "I was discussing the practical realities of James's death with someone who is helping me understand my financial situation. Grief doesn't eliminate the need to plan for the future." David watched Victoria deliver what should have been her greatest performance, the grieving widow wrongly accused by her mentally unstable husband's surveillance footage. She had crafted explanations for everything, spinning each piece of evidence as either innocent behavior or the product of David's alleged psychological breakdown. Her composure was flawless, her responses measured and convincing. Until Detective Stevens played the audio from Eleanor, Hartley's attempted murder. Victoria's voice filled the interrogation room with crystal clarity. That nosy old bitch next. Dor has been watching this house for months. I think it's time someone reminded her that accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business. For the first time since entering the room, Victoria had no immediate response. David watched her face cycle through emotion: surprise, rapid calculation, and finally, a kind of resigned fury.
You think you've won?
She said, meeting David's eyes directly for the first time. You think exposing me somehow makes you the hero of this story? Look what you've become, James. Look what you had to turn yourself into to catch me. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the intimate tone she'd used during their most private conversations. You faked your own death. You abandoned everyone who cared about you. You've spent months lying to police, to your best friend, to your therapist. You've become exactly like me, someone who destroys lives to get what they want. The words hit David like ice water. In pursuing Victoria, he had indeed become someone capable of elaborate deception, someone willing to manipulate and betray the people who trusted him. The difference, he said finally, is that I can still feel guilt about what I've done. You never could. Victoria smiled then, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her since the interrogation began. The guilt is just another form of self-deception. James, you'll learn that eventually. As guards escorted her back to her cell, Victoria paused at the door and looked back. By the way, there's something you should know about your friend Dr. Mitchell. She's been reporting on your psychological state to someone who's been very interested in your mental health. You might want to ask her who's been paying for those sessions. The door closed, leaving David staring at Detective Stevens with growing dread. Another layer of deception? Another revelation that his understanding had been incomplete? What did she mean? David asked. Stevens consulted her notes, her expression grim. We're still investigating, but it appears someone has been funding Dr. Mitchell's practice specifically to monitor your psychological state. Someone wanted detailed reports on your mental health and behavioral patterns. David felt the ground shift beneath him again. His sessions with Sarah, his one source of honest communication throughout this ordeal, had been compromised from the beginning. Even his attempts to maintain his sanity had been part of someone else's larger plan. Who was paying her? We don't know yet. The payments came through a shell corporation we're still tracing. But James, whatever this is, it's bigger than just Victoria and Marcus. They were working for someone else. As David left the police station, he realized Victoria's final revelation had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. Even in defeat, even facing life in prison, she'd managed to plant seeds of doubt and paranoia that would continue to grow. The confrontation was over, but the psychological damage would outlast any prison sentence. 6 weeks later, James Whitmore sat in a federal courthouse wearing his first suit in months, watching prosecutors dissect his former life as if he weren't present. The charges were substantial: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and filing false reports. The maximum sentence was 15 years, though his cooperation in Victoria's prosecution and the extenuating circumstances would likely reduce that significantly. Across the aisle, Thomas Brennan faced his own legal reckoning. James's oldest friend sat beside his attorney, the weight of his complicity evident in every line of his body. The man who had helped James fake his death now faced conspiracy charges that could destroy their business and devastate Thomas's family. Your Honor, Assistant District Attorney Margaret Chen addressed the court. While we acknowledge that Mr. Whitmore's actions led to the arrest of a dangerous criminal, we cannot ignore that he committed serious federal crimes in pursuit of what he perceived as justice. The law cannot function if citizens decide to take matters into their own hands, regardless of their motivations. James listened to the enumeration of his crimes with a detachment that would have alarmed Dr. Sarah Mitchell if she hadn't been revealed as another layer in the conspiracy that had consumed his life. The investigation into Sarah's funding had led to a shell corporation controlled by Marcus Campbell's former associates, people who had been monitoring James's psychological state for months before Victoria's plan reached its conclusion. The revelation. That his therapy sessions had been compromised struck James harder than any of Victoria's other betrayals. Sarah had been reporting on his mental health, his growing obsession with his investigation, his increasing willingness to abandon moral boundaries in pursuit of truth. Someone had been studying him like a laboratory specimen, documenting his transformation from victim to avenger. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said, drawing James's attention back to the present, "do you wish to make a statement before sentencing?" James stood, feeling the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. In the gallery behind him, he could see Amanda Cross, no longer Amanda Phillips, who had testified about Victoria's previous victims. Eleanor Hartley was there too, the elderly woman whose life he'd saved, sitting in the front row with her adult children who'd flown in from across the country. "Your Honor," James began, his voice steadier than he'd expected, "I want to acknowledge that my actions were criminal. I broke laws, deceived people who cared about me, and put innocent lives at risk. I justified these actions by telling myself I was pursuing justice, but the truth is more complicated." He paused, looking at Thomas, whose family's future now hung in the balance because of his loyalty. "I became the very thing I was fighting against. I became someone who manipulated others, who constructed elaborate deceptions, who was willing to destroy relationships and trust to achieve my goals. The fact that those goals included stopping a murderer doesn't excuse the methods I chose." James could see Victoria's defense attorney taking notes. He's probably planning to use his admission of moral compromise in her upcoming trial. But he'd moved. Beyond caring about the strategic implications of his words, "I want to be clear about something, though. Victoria Cross is a predator who has destroyed lives systematically for nearly a decade. Dr. Michael Torres killed himself because of her manipulations. 3 other men lost their life savings and their faith in human connection because of her calculated deceptions. Eleanor Hartley would be dead if we hadn't intervened when we did." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "Mr. Whitmore, the court recognizes the complexity of your situation. You were the victim of an elaborate fraud that targeted your deepest psychological vulnerabilities. However, the response to victimization cannot be vigilante justice, regardless of how sophisticated or successful that justice might be." The judge consulted his notes before continuing. "Given your cooperation with law enforcement, your lack of prior criminal history, and the extenuating circumstances of your case, this court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You will also pay restitution to cover the costs of the investigation into your staged death." James felt a mix of relief and resignation. 18 months was less than he'd feared, but it was still 18 months of his life that would be spent paying for decisions he'd made in pursuit of what he'd believed was justice. Thomas received a lighter sentence, 6 months in minimum security and 3 years of probation, primarily because his role had been reactive rather than initiating. But James could see the devastation in his friend's eyes. Thomas's reputation in the tech industry was destroyed, his family's financial security compromised, and their friendship might never recover from the weight of the consequences James's choices had imposed on him. After sentencing, James met with Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the court-appointed psychologist who would be evaluating his mental health throughout his incarceration and probation. Unlike his sessions with Sarah, these conversations carried no illusion of confidentiality or therapeutic alliance. Dr. Reynolds was there to assess his risk to society and his progress toward rehabilitation. "You understand that your case is being studied extensively," Dr. Reynolds said during their first session. "The psychological profile of someone who responds to victimization by constructing an elaborate counter-deception is rare. There are researchers who want to understand how a successful entrepreneur with no history of antisocial behavior could develop such sophisticated criminal skills so quickly." James nodded. "I'm aware. I've been told that several academic papers are being written about my case." "How does that make you feel?" "Like a laboratory specimen," James replied honestly, which is ironic, since that's exactly what Victoria and her associates were treating me as from the beginning. Dr. Reynolds made notes. "Do you still believe your actions were justified?" It was a question James had been asking himself for weeks. "I believe Victoria needed to be stopped. I believe Eleanor Hartley's life was worth saving. I believe the evidence I gathered will prevent future victims. But I also believe I could have found legal ways to achieve those goals if I'd been patient enough to try. What would you do differently? James considered the question carefully. I would have trusted the system I was so certain would fail. I would have gone to Detective Stevens immediately with what I'd discovered, even if it meant Victoria might have escaped initially. I would have protected the people who cared about me instead of using them as tools in my investigation. And if Victoria had escaped, if she'd disappeared and continued victimizing people, then I would have lived with that knowledge, and I would have continued working within the legal system to stop her. The ends don't justify the means, even when the ends include saving lives. It was a hard-won wisdom that had cost James his identity, his relationships, and his freedom. But as he sat in Dr. Reynolds' office, preparing for the first day of a prison sentence that would give him 18 months to contemplate the person he'd become, James realized that understanding the cost of his choices was the first step toward rebuilding something resembling a moral life. 2 weeks before he was scheduled to surrender himself to federal custody, James received a letter from Amanda Cross. She was testifying in Victoria's trial, helping prosecutors establish the pattern of victimization that would likely result in multiple life sentences. But her letter wasn't about the trial. "I wanted you to know," she wrote, "that Dr. Torres's sister reached out to me after the news about Victoria's arrest. She said that knowing her brother's death was finally being treated as the murder it was has given their family some peace. She wanted me to thank you for caring enough about victims you'd never met to risk everything to stop Victoria." James folded the letter and placed it in the box of personal items he was preparing for storage during his incarceration. The validation meant something, but it didn't erase the damage he'd done to himself and others in pursuit of justice. The reckoning was ongoing and would continue long after his sentence was served. 18 months later, James Whitmore walked out of federal minimum security prison carrying a single duffel bag and wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. The man who emerged bore little resemblance to the tech entrepreneur who had once commanded boardrooms and built million-dollar deals. Prison had stripped away the last vestiges of his former identity, leaving someone quieter, more careful, marked by an understanding of consequences that went deeper than any business lesson he'd ever learned. Thomas was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against a car that James didn't recognize. A modest sedan that reflected their company's dramatically changed circumstances. The reunion was awkward, weighted by everything that had happened between them and everything that could never be undone. "You look different," Thomas said as they drove through San Francisco traffic that seemed both familiar and foreign after 18 months away. "I feel different," James replied, watching the city he'd once called home scroll past the window. "How's the business?" Thomas's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "We lost most of our major clients after the trial. The company name is toxic now. Too much media coverage about the tech entrepreneur who faked his death. I've been keeping things afloat with smaller contracts, but we're operating at about 15% of our former capacity." James absorbed this information without surprise. He'd known that his choices would destroy more than just his own life, but hearing the specific details of the damage was still painful. "And your family?" Rebecca took the kids to her mother's house during the worst of the media attention. "They're back now, but—" Thomas trailed off, and James understood. Some wounds healed, but they left scars that changed the shape of everything around them. They drove to James's new apartment, a modest one-bedroom in the Mission District. That was a far cry from the Pacific Heights home he'd once shared with Victoria. The space was furnished with donations from a re-entry program for former inmates, basic but functional. It was the kind of place where people rebuilt their lives from nothing, which was exactly what James needed to do. "I've been following Victoria's trial," Thomas said, as he helped James unpack his few belongings. Life sentence without possibility of parole. The prosecutors were able to connect her to 5 murders, including Dr. Torres. Amanda Cross's testimony was devastating. Nodded. Victoria's trial had been extensively covered in the media, dissecting every aspect of her crimes and the investigation that had brought her down. He'd followed the coverage from prison, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and emptiness as justice was finally served. Marcus Campbell turned state's evidence, Thomas continued. Gave up the entire financial network they were part of. Apparently, Victoria wasn't working alone. There's a whole organization that specializes in long-term relationship fraud, targeting wealthy individuals. How many victims? They're still identifying them. The FBI has opened investigations. In 12 states, conservative estimate is somewhere around 40 victims over the past decade, with total losses exceeding $20 million. James sat on his new couch, donated furniture that carried the stories of other people's fresh. Startson tried to process the scope of what he'd uncovered. His personal quest for justice had exposed a criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of lives. It was validation of sorts, but it felt hollow compared to the cost of achieving it. A week after his release, James met with Dr. Reynolds for his first post-incarceration evaluation. Her office was in a generic professional building that smelled of industrial carpet and filtered air. Nothing like Dr. Sarah Mitchell's warm, deceptive sanctuary. "How are you adjusting to life outside?" Dr. Reynolds asked, reviewing the notes from his 18 months of evaluations. "It's strange," James admitted. "I keep expecting to feel relief or closure or some sense that justice has been served. But mostly I just feel tired." "That's not uncommon. You've spent 2 years living at an extreme level of intensity deception. Investigation, trial, incarceration. Normal life can feel anticlimactic after that kind of sustained crisis." James understood what she meant. Prison had been oddly peaceful in its simplicity-structured days. Clear rules, consequences that were immediate and understandable. The complexity of rebuilding a life in the real world was more challenging than the elaborate deception he'd constructed to expose. "Victoria, have you thought about what you want to do professionally?" It was a question James had been avoiding. His name was permanently associated with the case now. Google search would forever connect him to the story of the tech entrepreneur who faked his death to catch his murderous wife. Traditional employment in his field was essentially impossible. "I've been thinking about consulting," he said, "helping people protect themselves from financial fraud. Using what I learned about Victoria's methods to educate potential victims." Dr. Reynolds made notes. "That's interesting. You want to turn your experience into something constructive." "I want to believe that what I went through served some purpose beyond just satisfying my need for revenge." 3 months after his release, James received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Hartley stood at his apartment door, carrying a homemade pie, and wearing the kind of concerned expression that reminded him why he'd risked everything to save her life. "I hope you don't mind," she said, as he invited her in. "I got your address from the Victim Services Coordinator. I wanted to see how you were doing." They sat in his modest living room, sharing pie and coffee, while Eleanor told him about the aftermath of Victoria's arrest. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, but it had also brought her closer to her adult children, who had been horrified to learn how close they'd come to losing her. "I think about that night often," Eleanor said. "Not just because you saved my life, but because of what you sacrificed to do it. You lost everything: your identity, your business, your freedom to stop a woman most people had never heard of. From killing someone you barely knew." James set down his coffee cup, considering her words. "I'm not sure it was that noble. I think I was mostly trying to regain some sense of control after Victoria had made me feel so powerless." Eleanor studied him with the sharp eyes that had made her such an effective witness. Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what makes someone heroic, acting on their better impulses, even when their motivations are complicated. The conversation stayed with James long after Eleanor left. He'd spent so much time analyzing his transformation, cataloging the ways he'd become morally compromised in pursuit of justice, that he'd lost sight of the simpler truth. He'd saved an innocent life, and he'd stopped a killer from claiming more victims. A week later, James received a letter from Amanda Cross. She'd testified at Victoria's trial and was now working with the FBI to identify other victims of the criminal network Victoria had been part of. Her letter contained news that shifted something fundamental in James's understanding of his experience. The investigation into the shell corporation that funded your therapy sessions led to arrests in 3 other cities. It turns out that monitoring the psychological state of long-term marks was a standard part of their operation. They wanted to know when victims were becoming suspicious or unstable, so they could adjust their timeline accordingly. Your sessions with Dr. Mitchell weren't just compromised, they were part of a systematic approach to psychological manipulation that these people have been using for years. James read the letter twice, absorbing the implications. Even his attempts to maintain his sanity had been weaponized against him. Victoria hadn't just stolen his money and planned his murder. She'd turned his own psychological treatment into another tool for his destruction. But the letter contained something else. An invitation to speak at a conference for fraud investigators. Sharing his experience from the victim's perspective, Amanda had recommended him as someone who understood both the criminal mindset and the psychological impact of long-term financial fraud. James folded the letter and looked around his small apartment, at the donated furniture. The modest possessions, the simple life he was slowly building from the rubble of his former existence. The man who had once run a multimillion-dollar company was now considering a career as a public speaker at fraud prevention seminars. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was authentic in a way his previous existence had never been. He'd paid the price for the truth about Victoria, about himself, and about the kind of person he was capable of becoming under extreme circumstances. The cost had been everything he'd thought mattered: his identity, his wealth, his relationships, his freedom. But he'd survived the paying of that price, and he'd emerged with something Victoria could never steal from him. The hard-won knowledge of who he really was when everything else was stripped away. 6 months after his release, James Whitmore gave his first presentation to a room full of fraud investigators, telling the story of how a successful businessman had become a master of deception in order to catch a killer. He spoke about the psychological manipulation tactics used by long-term con artists, about the warning signs that potential victims should watch for, and about the importance of seeking help through legitimate channels rather than taking justice into their own hands. The audience listened with the focused attention of professionals who understood that the techniques he described could be used by anyone with sufficient motivation and moral flexibility. When he finished, a detective from Portland raised her hand. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Everything you did, everything you lost, was it worth it?" James considered the question that had haunted him for 2 years. He thought of Dr. Torres, who hadn't survived Victoria's manipulation. He thought of Eleanor Hartley, who was still alive because of his intervention. He thought of the 40 other victims who might find some justice because of the investigation his actions had triggered. "I regret the methods I chose," he said finally. "I regret the damage I caused to innocent people who cared about me. But I don't regret stopping a killer, and I don't regret surviving the process of learning who I really am." As he left the conference center that day, James realized that the price of truth was never paid just once. It was an ongoing debt, requiring constant vigilance against the temptation to become the very thing you fought against. But it was a debt he was finally willing to keep paying, one honest day at a time. The man who walked away from that conference was neither James Whitmore, the successful entrepreneur, nor David Carter, the obsessed avenger. He was someone new, someone who had learned that the most important truth wasn't about his wife's crimes or his own capacity for deception. The most important truth was that redemption was possible. Even after the worst betrayals, even after becoming someone you barely recognized, it was possible, but only if you were willing to pay the full price and keep paying it for the rest of your life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.